I just wondered, we're a little confused about when these new border rules take effect that Minister Duclos announced yesterday. Can you give us an update on when these things are going to go into effect?
So adding the listed countries of concern today, effective, and then with regards to the mandatory testing for those transiting through listed countries who are coming back to Canada, their pre-departure tests are no longer valid from those listed countries.
Right.
So they'll have to acquire a test from a third country that is not listed, effective today. And then with regards to the mandatory testing for all flights and all passengers, with the exception of those coming from the United States, will be coming in the very short term.
And what's the likelihood of expanding that to cover flights coming from the States or even the land border?
Well, as always, we're going to continue to get our advice from public health care officials, and just given that this is a new variant of concern, that advice is being watched very closely and in real time.
Do airports have the capacity to do this testing of inbound travel?
Well, what I would, yeah, no, it's a good, it's. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, and then I'll pass over les paroles. But with regards to operational resources, we'll spare no expense. We'll make sure that our airports, our frontline officers can handle the volume. Bonjour, monsieur.
Bonjour.
Merci.
Monsieur Trudeau, est-ce que le Canada a assez de doses de vaccins pour administrer une troisième dose à tous les adultes actuellement?
Évidemment, tout d'abord, on est en train de suivre les recommandations de NACI des experts. On va faire les étapes nécessaires selon ce qu'ils recommandent, mais je peux vous dire que l'accès aux vaccins, la quantité de vaccins n'est pas un enjeu pour nous. On en a énormément, on en a assez actuellement et on va en recevoir dans les semaines, les mois à venir. On a signé des contrats pour 2022 qui nous assurent que quels que soient les besoins, les recommandations des experts, on va en avoir assez pour tout le monde. In terms of boosters, our first priority is following the recommendations of NACI, of the experts in terms of when they should happen, what's the impact of the Omicron variant on that. There is not an issue about quantity of vaccines. We have lots of vaccines for boosters in Canada. We're receiving more into the new year. We are fine in terms of quantity. The issue is what is the best recommendation for people to get those boosters and when. On va commencer à les mettre en vigueur le plus rapidement possible. Maintenant, on a compris que même ce qu'on a, c'est-à-dire tous les voyageurs à l'international qui arrivent sont vaccinés, tous les voyageurs qui arrivent ont pris un test pré-embarquement. Maintenant, on va mettre cette extra couche de gens qui vont devoir se faire dépister à l'arrivée. Puis dès qu'on est capable de le faire dans les jours à venir, on va le faire. On faisait déjà du dépistage aléatoire. Ce qu'on est en train de faire, c'est d'augmenter pour que ce soit là pour tout le monde. Et on s'attend à ce que ce soit fait dans les jours ou la semaine ou deux qui viennent.
Just quickly on Huawei, can I just get you quickly on Huawei? What is taking so long to ban or approve Huawei?
We continue to follow the advice of our science, our experts, our intelligence and security analysts. We're working with the various telcos to ensure that there's a competitive environment, but that, of course, the safety and protection of Canadians is always there. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Minister Alghabra, have you made a decision with regards to the people coming into the country from the United States as to whether or not they're going to be tested? Minister Duclos was supposed to talk to his provincial counterparts last night.
Yeah. So, look, we made a decision right now about testing every traveler coming in from around the world other than the U.S. And we are having discussions, Mr. Duclos yesterday, with his provincial counterpart. So we need to be prepared and ready if we need to adjust that decision to include travelers from the U.S. We haven't made that decision yet. There are these conversations.
When is it coming? When is that decision coming? When is that decision coming?
I don't know. I don't know.
Are we talking days? Are we talking
depending on the changing situation, depending on the conditions in the U.S. So
we just started.
it's still very fluid, but if circumstances change, we will change our decision.
Are you expecting like a decision from the United States on their own testing rules before you decide if you're going to test or not?
No, the U.S. will make its own decisions based on its own information and own circumstances. Thank you. The circumstances. It's all based on the circumstances. Yeah, the epidemiology in the U.S., around the world. These are the circumstances that we use to make decisions. Thank you.
I wonder if you could say if the airlines are really worried about the border rules, are you going to be an advocate in there for the airlines and the tourist industry who don't like these border rules at all?
As I said yesterday to the Tourism Industry Association of Canada, safety first, then travel. The Canadian economy will not recover until the tourism economy does. We have to stay safe. Thank you.
Bonjour, Mme Saint-Don. Je voudrais savoir quelle est votre position sur les Jeux de Pékin, les demandes de boycott diplomatique. Qu'est-ce qui fait en sorte que vous n'avez pas pris de décision, à savoir si vous allez emboîter le pas aux Américains?
La décision n'a pas encore été prise. On est toujours en discussion avec les alliés. Le gouvernement, évidemment, respecte l'indépendance des comités olympiques et paralympiques canadiens. Et moi, en tant que ministre des Sports, ma priorité, c'est évidemment la sécurité des athlètes et leur succès.
La présence diplomatique,
What do you think about the Olympics in China? Should we have a diplomatic representation in your mind? Should we boycott it? What's your position?
Well, I'll start by saying that I've been having this conversation for 13 or 14 years because, as you're probably aware, I carried the flag for Canada at the Beijing Summer Olympics in 2008. And we had this conversation about whether the spotlight being on China could create positive change at the time, and I still believe that it is. We are having this conversation today because the Olympics are in China and because the genocide is a reality, but the Olympics always cast a brighter light on issues around the world. A good friend of mine from a large magazine reached out and asked, you know, if we could have a conversation, and it's my view that the Olympics do a good job shining a light.
But okay, we shine light, but nothing changes, and China says, hey, we're making all this dough with the Olympics. Is it enough just to shine light if we don't actually do some things?
The light is just the first step, in my view. And the issue with you know, whether there's a diplomatic boycott, we'll leave that up to the diplomats and the leadership to determine. I'm just insistent that our athletes, you know, are not tools of diplomacy. We have trade, we have embassies, we have ambassadors, we have international students, we have lots of different ways to work thoughtfully as government. But our athletes, they're meant to be non-political.
But the argument that is being made is that the athletes are being used as diplomatic tools by China.
I would disagree.
Doesn't it send the wrong message, though, to have Canadian athletes walking into the National Stadium in Beijing, waving to the crowd when not a year earlier China had kidnapped 2 of our citizens?
It's a fair point.
Do you view that it says the wrong
Can you
message?
just elaborate on that? You said you disagree that the athletes
Are being used?
Yeah.
I don't think that the athletes are being used. I don't think they're being used by competing in a country. Our athletes went to Russia and competed in Sochi, and the conversation around LGBTQ2+ inclusion was never before such, you know, in the spotlight, and it changed the conversation at the Canadian Olympic team. It changed the conversation at the IOC level. When I was chair of the Athletes Commission with the Canadian Olympic Committee, we then changed the charter to include LGBTQ2+ inclusion in the anti-discrimination policy. The Olympics are a big thing, and I'll acknowledge that, you know, they're they're complicated and nuanced and complex, but I don't believe that athletes are ever being used.
Can we go back to the Michaels argument? So are you saying that athletes should have been in Beijing even if the Michaels had still been in prison?
That's a hypothetical question. I won't address it.
Aren't Canadian athletes also citizens, and shouldn't they also care about what happened to the Michaels and not, you know, why should they be in China?
They should absolutely care, and I think you can compete in a country and still care about these issues. I don't think that being an athlete, caring about our athletes, or cheering for our athletes is mutually exclusive from believing in and caring about the Uyghur genocide.
But Mr. Vancouver, on a diplomatic boycott, I mean, there's the broader issues of Russia and their treatment of people, and then there's the direct targeting of Canadian citizens in an act of hostage diplomacy. I mean, it's a completely different level of direct threat, is it not? And invites a response based on what was done.
It was an example, not a comparison. Thank you,
What
guys.
about, I just want to ask you about the motion, Alexis Benedict's motion to push the games back.
Postpone.
Postpone, thank you, merci. A year. Why did you agree with that?
Alexis and Martin and I went for a beer last night, and we had a really long conversation. We had, I won't say more than one beer, but we went for a beer last night, and we're good friends. We know how to disagree thoughtfully and to have a nuanced conversation about a very complex issue. And what we agreed on was that it is possible to believe in our athletes, to cheer for our athletes, and to support Team Canada, and still care deeply about what's going on in China from a human rights perspective. Thank you, guys.
Bonjour, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de la situation à Québec, les policiers et ces arrestations?
Je trouve que, comme tout le monde, je pense que j'ai été choqué par les images qu'on a vues, puis il faut que la lumière soit faite sur cet incident-là. Je veux dire, quand on voit un policier pousser de la neige sur le visage de quelqu'un qui est déjà atterré, je pense que ça choque, ça a de quoi choquer la conscience.
Est-ce que ça dit quelque chose du service de police de Québec, des gens de Québec? Est-ce que tu peux tirer des conclusions?
Et je pense que c'est toujours très hasardeux de faire des généralisations, quelles qu'elles soient. Donc, mais je pense qu'il faut que la lumière soit faite sur cette intervention-là, définitivement. Puis s'il y a des problèmes systémiques et de culture, ben ça doit être analysé également.
Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de la réponse des autorités?
Je pense que pour l'instant, il faut juste qu'il y ait une enquête et qu'on vienne à bout des questions qui sont légitimement soulevées suite à cette intervention.
Quel genre d'enquête? Une enquête interne, externe? Qu'est-ce que vous voyez?
Personnellement, je vais laisser le soin aussi à Québec de faire son travail. Ce n'est pas de notre ressort, mais personnellement, j'ai toujours cru qu'il est mieux d'avoir des enquêtes externes sur ce genre d'incident. Merci.
The PBO has a report out on Indigenous water advisory.
Sure.
It says that you're spending enough money from a capital perspective to be able to address the timeline problem on the timeline you've set out, but that the operational funding isn't there.
I'd have to look at the report. This is something that I've been keenly interested in, obviously, in my former role and current role with the same relationship with chiefs that want to see clean water in their communities. Clearly, what we saw before the former Auditor General, the current Auditor General's last report, was that gap in financing for operations and maintenance. Now, that's the funding amount, but what's also important is the homegrown solution. So training up local folks to run the water operating plants, expansion of those plants if necessary, over multi-year funding formulas. We knew from the get-go when I sat down with my team a year and a half ago, that the 80% formula was just effective and had been defective for some time. So we moved that up to 100% formula. The current funding that we announced in this past December will effectively quadruple the amounts in operations and maintenance into communities. And we're willing to look at more solutions if we think the recommendations from the auditor hit home and are indeed accurate. That's something I want to look at, and I'll look at with Minister Haidu.
Is this going to be an ongoing challenge? Because some of these communities are very small. Any community of that size would struggle to, keep a technician there, especially if they're in high demand.
Oh, absolutely, and that's one of the first things that we saw is a lot of those communities, those members are the pride of their community, and if they're seeing a better salary offered in another, often non-Indigenous, why would I fault them for jumping at them? But it is the reality of those communities, and we can work with them with a number of there's circuit rider solutions that, for example, Manitoba has been amazing at doing, Quebec as well. We just have to have more saturation of those options and making sure that local folks are trained up to be the pride of their community and operating something that's such an essential asset. So absolutely it will be a challenge ongoing, but it's something we're willing to meet.
Do you have to...
Oh, sorry. Is the government going to set a new date for ending the drinking water advisory?
Look, I would direct you to the website that shows exactly what the plans are in for each community. We have said with those communities that we're willing to work at their pace. There are a number of communities, and it's their choice, that have decided to keep the long-term water drinking advisories on in the face of of water that is testing clean, or medium-term solutions. And they said, no, we want a long-term solution, and we respect that. So, but you'd have to look at each individual community, and there are a number of communities that have large capital projects left, and they will take a little time.
The government made a mistake at setting a hard and firm deadline that we're not even close to meeting? Or?
Look, I give credit to the Prime Minister of standing up and saying enough is enough. That is a shot to the civil service to get things going, and he stood up and put the money in place. So you look back at it in the face of a global pandemic. I'm very proud of people standing up, but we have to be truthful with our timelines to Canadians who are looking for answers. But behind all that is the resolve of this government to continue investing in essential water and essential assets in communities.
When you're designing the capital system, are you taking operations into mind in the future, and are you trying to, lessen the operational burden going forward? Making them easier to operate?
It's hard to generalize on that point. Obviously, we want the solutions that work for the community. We will work with their capital asset plans and the bidding procedure, which can be quite complex in a remote community where you perhaps have one contractor or two contractors, and given the influx of capital investments in Indigenous communities, those people are in high demand. So there are challenges there, and obviously we work with the community in their maintenance and needs as a matter of a resource. We also have to be conscious of the fact that as a federal government, we can't be dictating terms to Indigenous communities. So it's a question of cooperation at the end of the day, and it does vary from community to community.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Just wondering about getting some of the vaccines Canada has or has access to African countries, developing countries. I wonder if you can speak to the work that your government's doing to make sure the vaccine equity issue.
No, absolutely. I think it's a really important one. One, as we stated from the beginning, that the vaccine rollout for the world is so important because no one is safe until everybody has the vaccines. We've committed up to right now up to 200 million doses, the equivalent of 200 million doses. But we're more importantly working with the World Health Organization through COVAX to making sure it's an equitable distribution. So this is not just about vaccine rollout, where we're pooling the world's donations to come up with an equitable plan and making sure it's done appropriately. But this also includes the challenges that we have to deal with. So, for example, some nations are going to have different abilities to be able to absorb the vaccines. So in some places where we have vaccines, we've had challenges where they can't absorb it and where they've actually said, listen, can you wait until we get things set up? And I don't want to list those countries just yet. We're trying to get a handle on that. And unfortunately, we're also dealing with the issue of vaccine hesitancy. There are some nations even in Africa where they have dealt with issues of the secondary impacts of the pandemic because of the supply chain. It actually has prevented other health services that they normally get that has a detrimental impact. So we have to kind of deal with that aspect as well. So they haven't seen the direct impact of the pandemic, which is kind of contributing to vaccine hesitancy. And I also have to say that certain leaderships, people in important positions, have not pushed the importance of the vaccines as well. So leadership does matter there. So we're all coming together. I'm confident that the world is going to come together through COVAX to get this done, and I want to assure Canadians that Canada will be playing a very important role to convene and coordinate this response.
So what kind of position does that put Canada in when you have certain provinces considering booster shots for either wider populations or some populations already? Mm-hmm. When you have executives in COVAX saying, no, richer countries, we need you to donate more to us. What kind of a difficult position does that put Canada in trying to decide how to either roll out boosters or donate more?
So first of all, we need to look at it as the vaccine rollout between boosters and the first and second dose is very different. For example, certain boosters could be different based on the first and second dose. But having said that, we as a nation proactively ordered through the great work of procurement ordered a number of vaccines. And we know in Canada where Canadians have kind of relied upon which vaccines. So we do have many vaccines that are going to be in surplus, and those are what we were also committing to donate our surplus vaccines to COVAX. That's in addition to the approximate 200 million vaccine doses there. So one thing I can assure you, Canadians will not be impacted. We'll make sure that they're going to be looked after in terms of their first and second dose, obviously, and we want to encourage these Canadians to get their get vaccinated, and more importantly, making sure that the children are also vaccinated. I know my son's going to be vaccinated this Saturday, so encourage everybody to get their children vaccinated as well. But more importantly, the third dose, as we look at the different variants that are out there, that the Canadians will be looked after for the third dose. But having said this, we will be working together with the rest of the world, and Canada will do its part, and we will constantly review where we can provide that support. Vaccines is one piece, but we also need to look at the medical support and the PP issue as well. But we also have to be able to provide, do they have the ability to provide that support? And those are the conversations that I still need to have with the partners, and I look forward to once it's appropriate for me to be able to travel and go to Geneva and have those conversations. Okay, thank you so much.
You mentioned the back end sometimes, that they can't even receive them or they can't properly administer them yet. Is there something that Canada can do to help on that back end so that vaccine equity is increased in African nations, as we may have the ability to help them roll them out, because our rollout went out pretty well?
Yeah, so one is actually just on that, and having been on the COVID committee, and we looked at our ability to take in vaccine. Those are the questions that not only I have, but I know that the experts internationally at COVAX and Gavi are already working on that. They already had a really good system, which Canada was a part of when it comes to our vaccine rollout, when it comes to when it comes to polio and some of the other anti-malaria medication that we're giving out. And how do we use those same mechanisms to get the vaccines rolled out? And then where are those gaps? That's where we need to take a look at where we can provide that support. We need to identify them country by country, but we also need to take a look at which nations already have good support mechanisms in certain countries and leverage those mechanisms with the partnerships that we have. So we're right now, those are the things that we're working on. To answer your question very directly, so yes, Canada will be helping on the back end as well. Okay, thank you.